There's a particular kind of silence that falls over a room right before everything a person believes about themselves comes apart. It isn't loud, it doesn't announce itself, it just arrives. A held breath, a stalled heartbeat, the exact half second before the floor gives way. On the night of November the 9th, that silence swallowed an entire ballroom full of the toughest men on the East Coast. And the woman standing at the centre of it, the woman they had spent 20 minutes trying to break, never once raised her voice. She just waited, because she already knew what they were about to find out. Her name was Naomi Reeves, and before this night is over, 4 generals will cross a marble floor, stop in front of her, and salute. But to understand why that mattered, to understand why grown men who had survived combat went pale at the sight of it, you have to start where she started, at the back wall, alone, in a plain grey suit that nobody in that room thought was worth a second look. Camp Callahan sat on 400 acres of scrubbed flat Carolina coastline, hemmed in by pine and salt marsh, and 3 layers of fencing that most Americans would never see. It wasn't the kind of base you drove past on your way to work. It didn't appear on tourist maps. It housed special warfare units that trained hard, deployed quiet, and answered to a chain of command so short and so shielded that the men who lived there had begun, over the years, to believe the rules were something that happened to other people. On paper, Camp Callahan was one of the most decorated installations in the country. In practice, it had rotted from the inside out, and everyone who worked there in a junior uniform knew it. They just knew better than to say so out loud. The trouble began 48 hours before the reception with a memo. 3 lines, no signature anyone recognised. Office of the Inspector General. Command Climate Evaluation. Arrival window pending. That was all. But those words moved through the officer corps like a cold front. Captain Ed Palmer, the base commander, read the memo twice in his office with the door shut, and then he did what men like Palmer always do when accountability appears on the horizon. He started cleaning, not the floors, the record. Complaint files that had been sitting in the digital system for months were quietly pulled and moved into a locked cabinet behind his desk. Incident logs going back 1.5 years were flagged, then buried under the polite bureaucratic word, under review. He gathered his senior officers the morning of the reception and told them the evaluation was routine. Nothing to worry about, just smile and keep the answers short. Show them a clean ship. Volunteer nothing. And, he added, keep Brant in check tonight. Nobody in that briefing laughed, and nobody had to ask what he meant. Lieutenant Tyler Brant was the base's crown jewel. 28 years old, 2 combat tours, a chest that was already filling with hardware, and a bronze star packet moving up the line. He was the kind of officer the recruiting posters were built around. Tall, magnetic, quick with a joke, quicker with an insult. He walked through the compound like the walls belonged to him, and in a way they did, because for 3 years no one had told him otherwise. He spoke to enlisted sailors the way a man speaks to a parking meter. He spoke to women in uniform worse. And the reason no one corrected him was simple and ugly. Brant got results. He led. His men followed. His numbers were good. And in a place like Callahan, good numbers were a currency that could buy silence for almost anything. By 4 p.m, the reception hall had filled. White tablecloths, trays of champagne flutes catching the low gold light through the tall windows. Officers in dress uniform, ribbons pressed flat, laughing in tight clusters that never quite included the enlisted staff moving between them. Among that staff was a young woman named Simone Blake, 22 years old, petty officer 3rd class, 2 years on base, and in those 2 years she had perfected the single most important survival skill available to her. She had learned how to disappear. She carried a tray of glasses through the crowd with her chin down and her eyes forward, and she had trained herself not to react to the things she heard, because reacting was expensive, and she had learned that the hard way. As she passed a knot of senior officers, one of them lifted a glass off her tray without so much as glancing at her, turned to the man beside him, and said, loud enough that she was clearly meant to hear it, that the standards for who they let serve these events really did drop a little more every year. Simone's grip tightened on the tray. She kept walking. That was Callahan. If you were young, if you were a woman, if you were black, you kept your head down and your mouth shut, and you learned that the complaint box on the 2nd floor was really just a shredder with a slower schedule. At 4, a plain dark sedan rolled up to the main gate. No escort, no flag snapping on the fenders. just government plates and a single driver behind tinted glass. The door opened and Naomi Reeves stepped out into the Carolina afternoon. Grey suit, off the rack. No ribbons, no insignia. No rank of any kind pinned anywhere on her. A worn leather notebook tucked under her left arm, the cover soft and creased from years of being carried. She looked to anyone watching like a contractor who'd gotten lost, or maybe a visiting spouse who'd taken the wrong exit. Which was exactly the impression she wanted. Her aide, a sharp young captain named Priya Nair, had argued against it in the car. "Ma'am," she'd said, "protocol requires advance notification. They won't know who you are." And Reeves had answered without looking up from the window. "That," she said, "is the entire point. I don't want to see the base they've spent 2 days building for me. I want to see the base they actually run, when they think nobody who matters is in the room." So she walked through the gate alone. She showed the guard a standard identification card, the plain kind any civilian employee might carry. He glanced at it, glanced at her grey suit, and waved her through without a second thought. Inside the reception hall she found a spot along the back wall, between a folded flag and a glass case, and a portrait of some long-retired admiral. And she did the one thing that almost no one in that room ever did for anyone below them. She watched. She watched Captain Palmer shake hands and check his watch every 90 seconds, like a man waiting for a verdict. She watched the officers cluster by rank and pretend the enlisted staff threading between them were furniture. She watched a young woman with a tray get shoulder-checked by a passing lieutenant. Watched the glasses rattle and nearly go over, watched the young woman steady them with both hands, and exhale, and keep moving while the lieutenant walked on without a backward glance. Reeves opened her notebook. She wrote something down. She closed it again, and then she heard the laughter start on the far side of the room, and she looked up, and she saw the young lieutenant, with the easy grin, and the crowd already gathering around him, and she understood that he had found his entertainment for the evening. She understood too that it was going to be her. Tyler Brandt spotted her the way a hawk spots movement in a field, not because she was important, because she was out of place. He leaned toward the officer next to him and asked who had let the civilian in. The officer shrugged. Brandt tugged his dress jacket straight, and he crossed the room, and 4 of his men peeled off their conversations to trail behind him, because that was how it always went. He didn't walk so much as he arrived. Chin up, shoulders rolling, every step broadcasting the same message to the whole hall. This is mine, all of it, and I decide who belongs. He stopped 2 feet from her. His voice, when it came, was pitched to carry. "Excuse me, you look a little lost. This event is for military personnel. Actual military personnel." Reeves looked at him, calm, steady. "I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be," she said. Brandt smiled. It was not a kind smile. It was the smile of a man who has just been handed a stage. He turned to his little audience. "She says she's exactly where she's supposed to be." A ripple of laughter. He turned back. "So what's your rank, sweetheart?" He let it hang for a beat, savouring it. "Oh, right. Trash doesn't come with a rank." The words landed like a slap, and every head nearby turned. And here is the thing that unsettled Brandt. Though he couldn't have named it in the moment, she didn't flinch. People always flinched. That flinch was oxygen to him. The little reward he'd been chasing his whole career. Junior sailors flinched. Officers below him flinched. This woman in the cheap grey suit just stood there, like she'd been carved out of the wall behind her, and something about that stillness made him want to push harder. So he reached out and peeled the paper visitor badge off her lapel and held it up between 2 fingers, like something he'd found stuck to his shoe. "Naomi," he read aloud, dragging out each syllable with theatrical disgust. "No last name, no rank, just Naomi." He let the badge drop, and it fluttered down and landed face up on the marble at her feet. "Pick it up. On your knees. That's your rank tonight." The room didn't gasp. That was the part that would haunt some of them later, when they'd had time to think about it. Nobody gasped. The room simply adjusted, the way a room adjusts to a bad smell. A few officers found something interesting to look at on the ceiling. Most didn't bother. Several lifted their phones and started recording, because this was going to be a good one. 30 feet away, Captain Palmer watched the whole thing over the rim of his champagne glass. He took a sip. He turned to greet an arriving contractor, as though nothing at all were happening on his marble floor. Naomi did not pick up the badge. She didn't even look at it. She looked at Brant. "Are you finished?" she asked. Quiet. Not angry, not frightened, just a question. The kind a teacher asks a child who has run out of things to say. Brant's jaw flexed. He was not accustomed to being asked questions. He was accustomed to being the question. He grabbed a champagne flute off a passing tray. Simone Blake's tray. And Simone froze for half a heartbeat because she knew that look. She'd had it aimed at her before, and he shoved the glass into Naomi's hand, hard enough that the crystal bit into her palm. "There's your new rank," he said. "Waitress. Smile and serve. That's all women like you are good for." Someone behind him laughed. Then more of them. It built the way laughter builds when it's feeding on itself, growing louder because everyone can hear everyone else joining in. A lieutenant commander raised his own glass in a mocking toast and said she outranked the dishwasher, at least, and the room came apart laughing. Naomi held the champagne flute for exactly 3 seconds. Then she set it down on the nearest table. Carefully, precisely. The way you'd set down something that was going to be labelled and photographed later. And she opened her notebook and she wrote. Brant watched her write, and for the first time something flickered behind his eyes. Not fear. Not yet. Just confusion. Who writes things down at a party? He shoved the question aside and stepped in closer, close enough that she could smell the bourbon under the champagne. "You want to know your problem?" he said, dropping his voice so his men had to lean in. "You think showing up in an off-the-rack suit makes you somebody. It doesn't. You're nobody. You're less than nobody. People like you don't earn rank. You earn mops. You earn toilet brushes. You earn the privilege of cleaning up after men like me." He swept his arm across the room. "Every single person here has bled for this country, and you walked in off the street like a stray dog looking for scraps." Naomi closed the notebook. "Do you talk to everyone this way?" she asked. "Or just the ones you've decided don't belong?" "Just the ones who don't belong." "And who decides that?" Brant spread his arms wide, palms up, king of everything. "I do. Look around. You see anybody in this room who looks like you?" And the terrible thing was that he was right, in the only way that mattered to a man like him. She was the only black woman in that hall who wasn't holding a tray. 6 feet away, Simone Blake stood frozen with her serving tray, clutched to her chest, white-knuckled, and she had heard every syllable. She had lived every syllable. Different night, different man, same script, word for word. 2 months earlier, a senior chief had told her she was only there to fill a quota. She had filed a complaint. Palmer's office had answered with a form letter. Matter reviewed, no action required. Those 4 words that kept Callahan exactly the way it had always been. Brant still wasn't done. Men like him never are. He held up his hand and told her she had 10 seconds to walk out the door before he had security drag her out. And he promised, with a grin, that they wouldn't be gentle. Then he started counting on his fingers. 10, 9, 8. His men picked it up, chanting it like a countdown at a ball game because to them that's exactly what it was. 7, 6, 5. Naomi's eyes moved. Past Brant. Past the laughing officers. Past Palmer, still pretending to be deep in conversation with the contractor. She found Simone Blake across the room, and for 1 full second, the two of them looked at each other. And in that second, Simone saw something in the older woman's face that she couldn't put a word to. Not anger, not humiliation. Something deeper and steadier. Something that looked almost like a promise. 1, Brant said and dropped his hand. "Time's up. Get out." Naomi didn't get out. She bent down, unhurried, and picked her visitor badge up off the marble, and she pressed it flat between the pages of her notebook. Then she closed the notebook, tucked it back under her arm, and stood exactly where she'd been standing. The room went quiet. The countdown energy drained out of it all at once, and something new took its place. Brant could feel it, even if he couldn't name it. She wasn't leaving. She wasn't crying. She wasn't calling for help. She was simply waiting. And that, more than anything he'd thrown at her, put a crack in his certainty. "Fine," he said, and his voice had lost half its volume. "Your funeral." He turned his back on her and walked toward the bar, and his men followed, but slower now, and a couple of them glanced back over their shoulders. One young ensign looked like he wanted to say something. He didn't. Captain Palmer checked his watch. 4:58. His phone buzzed against his hip. A text from the gate. "Delegation vehicles inbound. 4-star plates confirmed. ETA, 2 minutes. Palmer straightened his tie and set his jaw and arranged his face into its best commanding officer expression. He had no way of knowing that the delegation's lead inspector had already been standing in his reception hall for 15 minutes and had already filled 3 pages of a worn leather notebook with everything she needed. At 5 o'clock exactly, the double doors at the far end of the hall swung open, and the sound came first. Boot heels on marble, perfectly synchronized, that hard, bright rhythm that snaps every spine in a room straight on pure instinct. A young protocol officer appeared in the doorway, and his voice cracked on the first word. "Attention on deck!" The hall froze mid-motion. Conversations died in throats. Glasses stopped halfway to lips, and 4 general officers walked in. Major General Elaine Carver, Major General Robert Sung, Brigadier General Marcus Doyle, Brigadier General Anthony Feld. Full dress. Enough stars and ribbons between the 4 of them to paper a wall. They walked in a single unhurried line, at the pace of people who have never once in their lives had to hurry, because the world has always waited for them. Palmer stepped forward with his hand out. "Generals, welcome to Camp Callahan. We've prepared a full." Carver walked past him. Sung walked past him. Doyle walked past him. Feld walked past him. Palmer's hand hung in the empty air like a question nobody was going to answer, his mouth still open around a sentence that had died on his tongue. The 4 generals crossed the reception hall in complete silence, and every eye in the room tracked them. Brandt stood at the bar with a fresh champagne flute, watching with mild interest. Generals came and generals went. They toured, they nodded, they left, and nothing ever changed. He'd seen it a dozen times. Then they stopped. They stopped in front of the woman in the grey suit. Major General Carver, 31 years in uniform, a woman with a reputation for ending careers the way other people end phone calls, squared her shoulders, brought her heels together, and saluted. "General Reeves, the command is assembled and ready for your inspection, ma'am." Sung saluted. Doyle saluted. Feld saluted. 4 generals. 4 salutes. Every one of them aimed at the woman Tyler Brandt had ordered onto her knees. The silence that dropped over the hall was not the polite kind. It was the kind that comes an instant before a building comes down. The kind where an entire room realises, all at once, that the ground they've been standing on has been hollow the whole time. Brandt's champagne flute tipped in his hand. The wine ran cold over his fingers and he never felt it. His mind was doing arithmetic it could not solve. The woman, the grey suit, no ribbons, no insignia. General Reeves, 3 stars, Lieutenant General, the Inspector General of the United States Army. The woman he had called trash. The woman he had told to kneel on the floor. The woman he had counted down like a stray to be chased off a lawn. She outranked every human being in that room, and she outranked him by a margin so vast it didn't have a name. Naomi Reeves returned the salutes in one clean motion. Then she opened her notebook. The same notebook. The same 15 minutes of writing. And she turned to Captain Palmer. "Captain Palmer," she said, and her voice carried without her raising it. "I'm going to need your conference room, your complete complaint files for the last 24 months, and every incident report filed under your command. All of them. Not the ones you selected for me. All of them." The colour left Palmer's face in stages. The cheeks first, then the forehead, then the lips, until he looked like a man watching his own career walk out of his body and leave the room. "Ma'am," he managed, we hadn't been informed of your arrival ahead of—" "That's correct," Reeves said, and closed the notebook. "You weren't informed. That was the design." She turned to Captain Nair, who had come in behind the generals with a leather briefcase. "Captain, set up in the conference room, pull personnel files on all senior staff, start at the top and work down." "Yes, ma'am." Reeves let her gaze move slowly across the hall. One time, the officers, the frozen enlisted staff, the phones that had been recording, the silver trays, the champagne. She looked at Brandt. He couldn't meet her eyes. She looked at Simone Blake, who was shaking now, though not from fear. "This is not a courtesy visit," she said. "This is a formal command climate inspection conducted under the authority of the Inspector General. Every person in this room is subject to interview. Cooperation is expected. Candour is required." She paused. "I've been standing here for 15 minutes. I've already seen enough to know this will not be brief." Then she walked toward the second-floor stairwell, and the 4 generals fell in behind her, and Naya fell in, and the protocol officer scrambled to keep up, and the reception hall stayed exactly where it was, frozen and hollow. Brandt set his flute down on the bar. His fingers were wet and they were trembling. The lieutenant commander who had toasted the dishwasher was staring at the marble as though he could will it to open and swallow him whole. And Ed Palmer stood alone in the middle of his beautiful, clean reception hall, and understood, in a way no phone call to JAG was ever going to fix, that the woman in the grey suit had watched him take a sip of his champagne and turn his back, and that she had written it down. Word travels fast on a military base. It travels faster when the word is catastrophic. By 14 minutes after the salutes, every building on Camp Callahan knew. The story moved through the barracks and the break rooms and the maintenance bays like a live current, and every retelling added a little more voltage. He told her to kneel. He called her trash. She's a 3-star. She's the Inspector General. He is finished. In the chief's mess, a master chief set down his coffee and said 3 words. God help us, and he wasn't talking about Brandt. He was talking about all of them, because a command climate inspection doesn't hunt one man. It hunts the system that grew him. Every buried complaint, every policy that was written and never enforced. Every leader who saw something wrong and decided it wasn't his to fix. Brandt was a symptom. Callahan was the disease. And Naomi Reeves had come with a scalpel. Upstairs in the conference room, she worked with the flat efficiency of someone who had done this many times before. Naya set up a secure laptop. 2 judge advocates arrived within the half hour, hauling boxes of blank interview forms and recording gear. The 4 generals sat along one side of the long oak table, the legal team along the other, and Reeves stood at the head and laid out the ground rules. Every conversation recorded with the subject's knowledge. No one interviewed with their commander in the room, and they would start at the bottom and work up, because the people with the least rank always had the most to say and the most to lose by saying it. She opened her notebook to the first page and read her observations aloud, calm and clinical, the way a surgeon reads an X-ray. Entered the facility at 4:41 in civilian attire. A senior officer made a derogatory remark about enlisted staff within their hearing, and not one officer present corrected him. The base commander stood roughly 30 feet away during a sustained verbal assault on a visitor and took no action whatsoever. A lieutenant publicly demeaned and attempted to remove a person he believed to be a civilian, using language consistent with racial and gender-based discrimination, in front of dozens of witnesses. Several of those witnesses recorded it. None of them intervened. The overall atmosphere suggested a pattern rather than an incident. She closed the notebook and told her team to confiscate and preserve every phone that had been recording, because those recordings were evidence now. 3 floors below, Tyler Brandt sat alone in the locker room, in his dress uniform, forearms on his knees, staring at the grey tile between his boots. His phone was in his hand. He had typed and deleted the same message to his father 4 times. His father, a retired colonel, had told him once that the day you stop being the loudest voice in the room is the day you lose. Brandt had built his entire self on being the loudest voice in Moin. In training when others quit in silence, on deployment when he cracked jokes in the middle of a firefight, in the officers' mess where his stories always got the biggest laugh. Loudness had always been rewarded, right up until this afternoon. He kept replaying it. 4 generals, 4 salutes. Her face when it happened. Not angry, not smug, not even satisfied. Just calm. The exact same calm she'd worn when he ripped the badge off her chest, when he called her trash, when he counted her down from 10. She had known the whole time. Every insult he chose, every laugh he pried out of the room, she had simply absorbed it and filed it away in that notebook like a scientist recording the behaviour of something behind glass. He hadn't been a warrior in that reception hall. He'd been a specimen. His phone buzzed. His platoon chief. Everyone to quarters. No one leaves the building. The inspection team is pulling files. He put the phone down and pressed the heels of his hands into his eyes. And behind the dark, he could still hear her. 2 words. Are you finished? She'd needed only 2 words, and they were louder than anything he had said in his entire life. Across the base in the enlisted barracks, Simone Blake sat on the edge of her rack, while her roommate talked a mile a minute about the 3-star general, and the files and the interviews. Simone barely heard her. She was thinking about that 1 second across the reception hall. the older woman's eyes finding hers in a room full of laughing men, and the thing she'd felt in that second, something she had not felt in 2 years at Callahan. Seen, not glanced at, not looked through, seen. She pulled open the bottom drawer of her desk. Under a stack of old training manuals there was a manila folder, and inside the folder were copies of 3 complaints she had filed over the last 18 months, along with every response, every unanswered email, every date. The first, the senior chief who called her a quota hire, answered 11 days later with matter reviewed, no action required. The second, the mop someone had left outside her rack with a note that said, "This is your real job," logged as received and then never touched again, her 2 follow-up emails swallowed into silence. The third was about Brandt himself 8 months back, when he'd looked her up and down at her station and said out loud that they really did keep lowering the bar. That one Palmer's office had answered fast in 3 days. Insufficient evidence of hostile intent. Case closed. No witnesses interviewed. No conversation with Brandt. Case closed. Simone held the folder in both hands. She kept these copies because some stubborn, unbreakable part of her had refused to let them vanish completely, even after the system made it clear it wanted them to. Now she had a decision. She could say nothing, keep her head down, survive the way she'd always survived, or she could carry this folder up 2 flights of stairs. She looked at the door, she looked at the folder. She thought about the woman who had stood perfectly still while a room full of hard men tried to break her with words and never gave them the flinch they were hungry for. She closed the drawer, but she did not put the folder back inside. She set it on top of the desk. The interviews began at 5:30 and did not stop for 11 hours. The first subject was a young seaman from the mailroom who sat down with his hands folded so tightly the knuckles had gone white, and told Reeves that everything was fine. Everything was completely fine. She let the silence sit. Then she asked him, gently, when was the last time he'd watched someone get treated unfairly and watched nobody do anything about it. He looked at the recorder. He looked at the lawyer. He looked at her. Today, he said, in the reception hall. But also before today. That was the first crack. It was very far from the last. Over the next 4 hours, they interviewed 19 people, and the pattern developed like a photograph in a darkroom, slow at first and then all at once. A petty officer told of being informed by a chief that she was occupying a slot someone more deserving had earned. She filed a complaint. It was acknowledged. Nothing happened. A black lieutenant described being passed over for a school seat that went to a less qualified peer and being told by his department head to focus on what he could control. He filed a complaint. It was acknowledged. Nothing happened. A Latino chief described reporting a cluster of officers joking about the diversity hires in the break room, only to have the executive officer tell him the men were blowing off steam, and never hand him a complaint form at all, so that no complaint was ever officially filed. Every story was different in its details, and identical in its shape, and every shape pointed at the same door. Reeves kept her face flat through all of it. Anger she had decided decades earlier was a luxury an inspector could not afford. What she felt instead was colder and more useful. The steady, precise recognition that she was looking at a command that had been rotting from the top for years, and that everyone underneath it had been breathing the rot so long they'd started calling it the weather. At 9:15, Naya knocked and said there was a petty officer 3rd class named Simone Blake asking to speak with the team, and that she'd brought documentation. Reeves remembered the tray, the white knuckles, the single second of eye contact. Send her in. Simone came in with the manila folder held against her chest like a shield and sat down across from a lieutenant general. She took one breath, and then another, and then she opened the folder and spread 18 months of her life across the oak table. 3 complaints, every form, every response, every unanswered email. Reeves read them slowly, the way a person reads a letter from a world they'd always known was there but had hoped they were wrong about. When she finished, she asked whether, after the complaint about Brandt, anyone from the command had ever contacted her. No, ma'am. Whether anyone had interviewed Brandt. Not that she knew of. Whether anyone had told her why it was closed in 3 days. No, ma'am, just the email. Case closed. Reeves set the pages down. Petty Officer Blake, she said, did you consider not coming up here tonight? Yes, ma'am. For about an hour. What changed your mind? Simone looked down at her hands, and this time they were steady. "You stood there," she said quietly. "He said every single thing he could think of to make you small. And you just stood there. You didn't yell, you didn't cry, you didn't leave." She looked up. "I've been leaving for 2 years, Mum. I figured maybe it was time to stand." Reeves held her gaze a long moment. Then she turned to her legal officer. "Enter Petty Officer Blake's records into the file. Flag all 3 for failure to follow complaint processing procedure, and note that she came forward voluntarily, with no promise of any outcome." She looked back at Simone. "Thank you, Petty Officer. What you did tonight took more courage than most of the people in this building will ever understand." Simone stood and nodded and made it into the hallway before the tears came. Not the sad kind, but the kind that arrive when you've been carrying something so long you forgot how heavy it was until the moment you finally set it down. At 20 to 11, it was Brant's turn. He came in wearing his service uniform now. No dress whites, no entourage, no glass in his hand, and sat down across from the woman he'd tried to humiliate 6 hours earlier. Reeves never mentioned the reception. She didn't need to. She asked whether he was aware of a complaint filed against him by Petty Officer Blake 8 months ago. He said he vaguely recalled that something had been dismissed. "Closed," she corrected him. "Not dismissed. There's a difference. Had he ever been interviewed about it? No. Had he ever been formally notified it existed? He'd heard about it through the chain, he said, not through any formal process." She made a note. Then she asked him to describe what had happened in the reception hall. He said he'd asked a woman whether she was in the right place. "Was that all?" she asked. Silence. "Lieutenant," she said, "there are several recordings of the interaction currently being reviewed by my team, and I'd encourage accuracy." His jaw worked. His eyes dropped to the table. "I was out of line," he said. "Describe what out of line looked like," she said. Another silence. Longer. "I made comments about her appearance, about whether she belonged. I used language that was inappropriate." "You called her trash," Reeves said, without heat. "You told her to get on her knees. You told her women like her scrub toilets. You started a countdown to pressure her out. Is that accurate?" Each sentence landed on him like a brick, added to a stack he could feel on his chest. "Yes, ma'am." "And did any officer in that room intervene?" "No, ma'am." "Did Captain Palmer?" "No, ma'am." "Was Captain Palmer present?" Brant hesitated, and behind his eyes loyalty and self-preservation fought a short, ugly war, and self-preservation won. "Yes, ma'am." He was present. Reeves wrote for a moment without looking up. "Lieutenant," she said, "I'm not here to end your career over one afternoon. I'm here because one afternoon exposed a climate that made that afternoon possible. And that's been making afternoons like it possible for a long time. Do you understand the difference?" He nodded, looking like a man who has just learned the difference between a crack in a wall and a crack in a foundation. She dismissed him, told him to remain on base and available. He was at the door with his hand on the handle when she spoke again. "Lieutenant, the next time you decide to ask someone their rank, consider that you might not want the answer." He left without a word. Palmer's interview started at 11:30 and lasted 47 minutes and did not go well for him. Reeves laid Simone's 3 complaints on the table. She laid down the incident logs Nair's team had pulled out of his locked cabinet. She laid down printed stills from 4 separate phone recordings of the reception hall. Palmer looked at the spread of paper the way a man looks at a shallow grave. She read him the numbers. 31 equal opportunity complaints processed in 24 months. 28 of them closed with no action. 2 referred upward only under the pressure of outside inquiry. 1 still pending. She asked him to explain the ratio. He tried. He used the words context and nuance and operational tempo. He said his team took every complaint seriously. He said he trusted his people to handle things at the lowest level. She let him finish. Then she opened her notebook. "At 4:52 this afternoon," she said, "I was standing in your reception hall while one of your officers called a visitor trash, told her to kneel, and tried to have her removed. You were roughly 30 feet away. You saw it and you heard it, and you took a sip of champagne and turned your back." She closed the notebook. "That is not context, Captain. That is command failure." Palmer opened his mouth and nothing useful came out. She concluded the interview and told him he'd learn the findings through his chain of command, and that he'd be wise to start thinking carefully about his next conversation with the judge advocate. He stood, and his legs didn't quite cooperate, and he steadied himself on the back of the chair and walked out like a man leaving a doctor's office after very bad news. When the door closed, Reeves sat alone for a full minute and looked at the stack on the table. 31 complaints, 28 buried, 3 of them belonging to a 22-year-old who had kept her own copies in a folder under her training manuals because she'd understood, correctly, that the system was never going to keep them for her. Reeves opened her notebook to a clean page and wrote 2 words at the top: systemic failure. Then she picked up her phone and called Washington. The report reached the Secretary of the Army's desk 11 days later. 47 pages, a dozen appendices, more than 100 footnotes. A bar, the kind of document that ends quietly and destroys loudly. Inside the Pentagon, they called it the Callahan Report. The findings ran in 3 tiers: individual misconduct, leadership failure, and systemic dysfunction. Most reports had 1 tier, maybe 2. 3 meant the rot had reached the foundation. The consequences arrived in waves. The first hit Brandt. 14 days after the reception, he received formal notification of non-judicial punishment. Conduct unbecoming an officer, violation of equal opportunity regulations, failure to maintain professional standards. He was not court-martialed. Reeves had been deliberate about that in the report, writing that his conduct, egregious as it was, had been produced by a command that rewarded aggression and punished dissent, and that punishing the man without repairing the climate would be treating the symptom and leaving the disease. But the symptom still cost him. He was pulled from his team. His medal packet was withdrawn. He was reassigned to an administrative post at a training facility, far inland. No deployments, no glory, no audience. Where he would spend the next year and a half processing paperwork for exactly the kind of junior sailors he used to look straight through. His father called the night the orders came, and for the first time in Tyler Brandt's life, the old colonel had nothing to say. The second wave hit Palmer. 3 weeks after the reception, he was formally relieved of command, loss of confidence in his ability to command, the phrase that means finished in plainer words. It rested on 3 findings: his failure to enforce equal opportunity policy, evidenced by that 28 of 31 dismissal rate, his failure to act during a witnessed incident of officer misconduct, and the finding that buried him, his deliberate concealment of complaint records during the pre-inspection window. When Nayer's team had opened his locked cabinet, they had found not only Simone's 3 complaints, but 14 others, pulled out of the digital tracking system and kept only on paper, off the books, invisible to any oversight. Palmer hadn't just ignored complaints, he had engineered their disappearance. He filed his retirement papers within 72 hours. No ceremony, no farewell dinner, no folded flag. He drove off the base one Tuesday morning in a rental car, and the gate guard waved him through without a word. The third wave was quieter and far bigger. Acting on Reeves's recommendations, the Inspector General's office ordered a full rebuild of Callahan's command climate machinery, and the changes were written to be specific, measurable, and hard to undo. An independent equal opportunity office was stood up on the base, reporting directly to the Regional Inspector General instead of to the base commander. Complaint timelines were mandated, acknowledgement within 48 hours, investigation opened within 14 days, resolution within 60 dinings, and every complaint and its outcome logged in a central database that oversight authorities could see. A command climate survey would run every 6 months, and its results would reach the Inspector General before they ever reached the base commander, so that no commander could ever again control the story before anyone else was allowed to read it. 12 officers received formal counselling letters. 3 senior enlisted leaders were reassigned. The executive officer, who had never handed out that complaint form, was placed under investigation for obstruction. The culture did not change overnight. Culture never does. But the architecture changed. The walls that had sheltered the bad behaviour came down, and windows went up in their place. And then there was Simone. On the 15th of the following month, she received a letter from the Inspector General's office, signed by Naomi Reeves. All 3 of her dismissed complaints had been reopened, reviewed, and substantiated. The chief who'd called her a quota hire drew a formal reprimand. The sailors behind the mop were identified through witness interviews and disciplined. Brandt's lowering the bar remark was added to his punishment record, and at the bottom of the typed page there was a line that no regulation required. added in Reeves's own handwriting. Petty Officer Blake. You kept the copies when the system wouldn't. You spoke when the room stayed silent. Your courage is not a footnote in this report. It is the reason this report exists. Simone read it 3 times, then folded it into the manila folder with her complaint copies and put the folder back in the drawer. But not under the training manuals this time. On top, 6 months after the report, Naomi Reeves came back to Camp Callahan. Not in a grey suit this time. Full dress uniform, 3 stars on each shoulder, 4 rows of ribbons, the same worn leather notebook under her arm. The gate guard recognised her before she reached for her card and saluted so fast he nearly dropped his clipboard. The base looked the same from the outside, same runways, same pine and salt marsh. But inside the air had changed. Not fixed, not healed, but different. The new commander, a 26-year veteran named Captain Rita Danvers, met her at the entrance and didn't sugarcoat a thing. Better, she said, when Reeves asked about the climate. Not fixed. Better. 43 complaints processed in 6 months. Everyone investigated. Everyone answered. Some people still don't trust it. Can't blame them. Trust takes time, Reeves said. Accountability takes longer. They walked the compound together, and Reeves noticed the small things. A junior enlisted woman walking down a corridor without pressing herself against the wall to make room. Officers and enlisted sailors sitting at the same break room table, not sorted by rank and colour the way they'd been 6 months earlier. A bulletin board by the main office with the reporting hotline printed in letters you could read from 20 feet away. Small things, but culture is built out of small things. Near the end of the visit, she passed the reception hall. Same room, same marble, same tall windows. She stopped in the doorway and looked at the spot where she'd stood. And Nair beside her followed her gaze and asked if she was all right. Somewhere on that floor, 6 months ago, a badge had landed face up after a young lieutenant tore it off her lapel. She could still hear the plastic clicking on the stone. She could still hear the laughter. "I'm fine," she said. "I was just thinking." "About what, ma'am?" And Reeves smiled, the first time Nair had seen her smile since the inspection. "He asked me what my rank was," she said. And the truth is, my rank was never the thing that mattered that night. What mattered was that a 22-year-old had been keeping copies of complaints in a folder under her training manuals for 18 months, waiting, hoping somebody would come along who was worth handing them to. She looked at Nair. "I didn't change this base." She did. All I did was open the door. They walked out into the late afternoon light, and Reeves climbed into her car and set the notebook on the seat beside her and pulled away from Camp Callahan for the last time. And behind her, in the enlisted barracks, Simone Blake was packing a bag for her first day at leadership training school, nominated, personally, by the new commander. She zipped the bag, looked around the small room one last time, and picked the manila folder up off the top of the desk. She didn't need it anymore. The system had her copies now. She packed it anyway. Some things you keep, not because you have to, but because they remind you of the day you stopped leaving and started standing. So let me leave you with the question that started all of this. If you had been standing in that room, watching one man tear a stranger apart with words while everyone around him laughed, what would you have done? Would you have spoken up? Or would you have found something interesting on the ceiling to look at, like everybody else? Be honest with yourself, because the loudest person in a room is almost never the most powerful one. Real authority doesn't strut, and it doesn't announce itself, and it doesn't need you to be afraid of it. It watches, it listens, it writes things down, and when the moment comes, it moves, quietly, completely, and without ever raising its voice. Respect the person in front of you, whoever they are, whatever they're wearing, whatever tray they happen to be carrying. Because you never, ever know who is standing there, waiting to find out exactly what kind of person you are when you think nobody important is watching. If this story hit you the way it should have, do me a favour. Hit subscribe, because respect isn't handed down by rank, it's earned by character. Drop your answer to that question down in the comments. I read them. And send this to someone who needs to hear it today. Because somewhere out there, right now, there's a young person in a plain uniform keeping their own copies, in their own folder, still leaving, still waiting for the day they decide to stand.